The conquest of Britannia had begun without him. For nearly 6 months the Emperor Claudius had been away from Rome, sitting in the lands of the Atrebates tribe along the southern coast of Britannia, in an area known as the Solent. Verica was Rome's ally, a king from the tribe that had allied with Julius Caesar almost a century earlier. But Rome's allied king had been exiled by Caratacus, a king from the Catuvellani tribe who had risen in dominance, giving Claudius and Rome the perfect reason to venture once again into Britannia. Beyond the grey waters of the inlet and the muddy camps of the legions, somewhere to the north and the west, Aulus Plautius and 40,000 Roman soldiers fought the battles that would determine whether Britannia became a province of Rome or remained beyond its grasp. Meanwhile, Claudius waited. He waited for messengers, he waited for reports, and he waited for word that the time had come for him to join the army at the front and claim the victory that others would win for him. With Claudius came his 2 future sons-in-law, Pompeius Magnus and Lucius Silanus, along with a host of Roman senators, each of whom were clearly missing the comforts of Rome as they traipsed around in the mud and fog. But Claudius could ill afford to leave these men at home. Many had opposed his accession, and some still viewed him as little more than the beneficiary of a Praetorian coup. In the emperor's absence, such ambitious senators might prove troublesome for the household he left behind. So while those senators who had supported Claudius's accession remained at Rome, those who had not now found themselves standing alongside the emperor in the muck of Britannia. It was better this way, Claudius decided. After all, when the divine Augustus marched to war against Claudius's grandfather, Marcus Antonius, hadn't he forced most of the Senate to accompany him? Pompeius and Silanus, on the other hand, accompanied the expedition at the urging of Messalina. The empress had begged Claudius not to surround himself exclusively with senators, men who might betray him even in the mud. If misfortune befell Claudius in Britannia, she argued, family should be close at hand. And so Claudius had conceded and brought the 2 young men with him across the sea. Fortunately for Claudius, he had the perfect man to act as his representative in Rome. Not as a replacement emperor, for the imperial freedmen remained in constant communication with Britannia, but as the intermediary between the Palatine and the senators who remained behind. His name was Lucius Vitellius. He had fought alongside Claudius's brother Germanicus during his campaigns in Germania. He had accompanied Germanicus to the east and had been present at his deathbed, where he swore to avenge his name and protect his widow and children. Vitellius had been the lead prosecutor in the trial of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso for the murder of Germanicus. After serving as governor of Syria, where he amassed enormous wealth, Caligula recalled him to Rome with the intent of prosecuting him for bribery so as to confiscate his estates and add them to Caligula's growing imperial treasury. But Vitellius had been clever. No sooner had he arrived in Rome than he fell on his face before Caligula, hailing him as divine, at the same time offering to the young god everything he owned. Of course, Caligula was as pleased as he was surprised, but he did not prosecute Vitellius, nor did he confiscate his estates. Instead, Caligula made the man one of his new court favourites. Vitellius had survived Tiberius, Sejanus, and Caligula. A shameless flatterer he may have been, but never had Vitellius been named in a plot. He merely served, with his own courtly savoir-faire, and he practically worshipped the ground Messalina walked on. She had once lost a slipper from her foot, which Vitellius had quickly retrieved, refusing to give it back. Carrying it always inside his toga, Vitellius would occasionally bring forth the slipper and kiss it gently, as if it were a baby doe. He performed this theatrical display openly before Claudius and all the court, a compliment to the beauty and delicacy of the emperor's wife. And Claudius greatly appreciated the gesture, knowing there were plenty of senators who resented Messalina's place within the imperial family. And so, with Vitellius acting as liaison to a friendly senate in Rome, his freedmen Narcissus, Polybius and Pallas maintaining the administrative running of the empire, and Messalina controlling the Palatine, Claudius had left Rome, secure in the knowledge that the capital remained under control. All that remained now was for Aulus Plautius to summon him to the front lines. At last the summons came. The message arrived shortly after dawn, carried by a mud-spattered courier who had ridden for days through territory only recently brought under Roman control. Aulus Plautius had done what Claudius had waited for him to do. The tribes around Camulodunum had been defeated. Their stronghold was surrounded. The time had finally come for Claudius to leave the safety of the Solent and journey north. For days, Claudius travelled through lands ravaged by war. Behind him trailed the reluctant senators, men who now longed for the relative comfort of the Solent. They walked along paths shaped by time and wagons, rather than the paved streets of the empire to which they were long accustomed. Rocking back and forth on his litter, Claudius observed the countryside as his military train passed abandoned villages, many with gates still smouldering. The fields surrounding the villages were burnt and black. Aulus Plautius had left the tribes little choice but to abandon their defences or starve behind them. Going in the opposite direction, heading back towards the coast, Claudius's army passed prisoners marching in chains, ready for transport back to Rome, to be sold on the slave blocks. And Roman soldiers, wounded or ill, limped south toward the coastal camps, where Rome's surgeons awaited them. As the military train passed by the remnants of battles, Claudius saw the dismantled siege equipment, the broken swords and shattered shields, destroyed chariots laden with Roman arrows, and helmets and shoes half buried in the mud, alongside dismembered limbs painted in blue woad. Arriving near Camulodunum, along the banks of the murky waters of the Tacitus River, Claudius climbed out of his gig and was immediately escorted into the Roman barracks and brought to the command chamber of Aulus Plautius. "Hail Caesar!" Plautius announced sharply as the emperor leaned on his cane in the entryway. "Hail Caesar!" echoed the men assembled around the campaign maps spread across the table. Claudius recognized them at once. There was Titus Flavius Sabinus and his younger brother Titus Flavius Vespasianus, commanders of the Second Augusta. Beside them stood Gnaeus Hosidius Geta, whose 9th Hispania had only recently arrived from Mauritania, where he had helped suppress the unrest that followed Caligula's execution of King Ptolemy. "You have arrived at the perfect moment, Caesar," said Aulus Plautius as he came around the table to take Claudius by the elbow. "The kings are ready." "Kings?" Claudius asked as Aulus Plautius led him toward a table upon which sat a jug of wine. 11 of them, Aulus confirmed, all here to bow to the might of Rome, to the authority of Emperor Claudius. Grabbing the cup of wine offered to him, Claudius gulped it down quickly. "And Caraticus?" he asked. "Entrenched inside Camulodunum," the general responded. "But that ends tonight. Would you like to have a hot bath and a warm meal before the final push?" But Claudius shook his head. "No, let's just get on with it," he answered with a dismissive wave of the hand. Dressed in military armour, covered by a gold-bordered toga picta and crowned with a golden laurel wreath, Claudius emerged from the chamber where the attendants had prepared him. Aulus Plautius took him once again by the elbow and gently guided him through the military encampment and to the front gate. Signalling that the door be opened, Claudius beheld a sight unlike anything he could have ever imagined. The army seemed to stretch endlessly across the plain. Standards rose above the ranks like a forest of poles, while crimson banners snapped in the breeze. Eagles of gold glinted in the afternoon sunlight, and the insignia of the legions rippled with movement as thousands upon thousands of soldiers stood assembled before the city of Camulodunum. Lined up behind the legions stood the siege equipment. Mounted upon enormous wheels, they towered over the assembled soldiers, some nearly as high as the insulae apartments in Rome. Their timber frames creaked in the wind, while ropes, ladders and platforms dangled from their sides, all awaiting the order to advance upon the walls of Camulodunum. Flanking the legions on each side, thousands of equestrian soldiers sat upon Gallic war-horses dressed in ornamental armour. Moving like a river of flicking tails and blowing manes, the horses fidgeted anxiously, awaiting the blow of trumpets that would set them racing towards the city. Once again, Aulus Plautius took Claudius by the elbow. "Are you ready, Caesar?" With a nod of his head, Claudius, relying partly on Plautius and partly on his cane, slowly made his way behind the legions and behind the siege works, then stopped suddenly, mouth agape. Hidden from the view of Camulodunum, gigantic, lumbering war elephants stood on flattened feet. With skin grey and leathery, great flapping ears, and a long nose flanked by ivory tusks, the elephants stood in formation, with their heads swaying gracefully from one side to the other. From time to time, one of the beasts raised its trunk and let loose a blast so deep and powerful that it sounded almost like Rome's own war horns. Moving alongside the elephant at the centre, Claudius could not fathom their size. He had heard of Africa's war elephants. Anyone who had read Julius Caesar's commentaries had, but to see it in person was something else. Then, from the top of the elephant, a rope ladder fell. "I'm going up there?" Claudius asked, turning wide-eyed to Aulus Plautius. Plautius smiled. "Well, you are Caesar," he quipped, then added, "and it is quite safe. She is very tame and fitted with a saddle. It will be just like riding a horse. A big horse." Heaving a nervous sigh, Claudius handed his cane to Aulus Plautius and began to climb. Within 2 steps, a hand reached down to help him up and into his saddle. Sitting atop the war elephant, Claudius gripped the saddle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. With his face frozen, he looked around at the vast machinery of Roman conquest that lay before him. Then, closing his eyes, he offered a quick prayer to Mars, the god of war, to keep him safe. Finally, the horns blew, and the whole army slowly began to surge forward. At once, Claudius heard the sounds of commotion somewhere up ahead, but he could see nothing beyond the siege towers. Smoke rose in the sky as the sun began to set, and groups of horses wove in and out of his vision, riding back and forth as the noise of the moving army thundered through the air. As they closed in on Camulodunum, the 2 siege towers in front of Claudius began to separate, each angling in the opposite direction. As they parted, Claudius saw them. 11 kings and queens of Britannia stood on the ground before the walls of Camulodunum. One by one, they lowered themselves to their knees. From atop his war elephant, Claudius stared down as the last rays of sunlight caught the gold of his laurel wreath and the border of his toga picta. Surrounded by smoke and the assembled might of Rome, he suddenly understood what Aulus Plautius had just done. Before the kings of Britannia, before the legions, and before Rome herself, Tiberius, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus had just become the conqueror of Britannia.